Hi, I'm Derek Laufman, and I'm the creator of The Witch of Wickerson, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Derek Laufman about his graphic novel, The Witch of Wickerson. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Derek has been a professional comic artist and illustrator for over 20 years and resides in London, Ontario. He studied classical animation at Sheridan College, and for several years now, Derek has been drawing and creating his own comics and graphic novels, including Ruined World, Bot 9, and The Witch of Wickerson. Derek is also a freelance illustrator who has worked with DC, Marvel, DreamWorks, Topps, Hasbro, and Mattel. His credits include artwork for Star Wars Adventures for IDW, Batman Black and White for DC, Adventures of Superman for DC, and many more. He is the designer of Marvel's superhero adventure line as well as DC's Super Friends. The story of The Witch of Wickerson goes like this. In the quiet sanctuary of Wickerson Grove, a haunting figure of legend is about to ascend upon the community. This is a story about a witch and her cat Samson who gather, cook, and feast on the small inhabitants of the grove before falling back into their long slumber. When his son goes missing at the hands of the witch, Tobin embarks on a dangerous journey to get him back at all costs. So without further ado, here's my chat with Derek Laufman about his graphic novel, The Witch of Wickerson. So Derek Laufman, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
It's my pleasure.
Appreciate your time. What I usually do to start off the interview is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
I don't remember the number, but I believe it was a G.I. Joe comic. Yeah, I grew up in the 80s, born in 77. So G.I. Joe was a big part of my life. And I think just my parents had brought home G.I. Joe comic. I think that's the first comic I remember holding. I was probably 5 or 6, maybe.
Was that because of the TV series, you think?
I think so. Yeah. I believe so. And I don't have the comic today, but that was my first memory of sort of holding a comic. I probably couldn't read it, if I'm being honest, back then. But a big part of my comic book sort of history was buying comics for art anyways, not so much for story, because I was always drawn more to art. So I would just flip through comics for their artwork, and that's what drew me to them.
Sure. So great inspirations growing up, but I'm wondering who or what inspires you to create today?
Oh my goodness. There's so many, it's weird. Like comic books, like growing up, like a lot of my influences were like Image comics. Mm-hmm. And now that I'm older, and that was like when I was a teenager, now that I'm older, I'm actually drawing a lot of inspiration from like Miyazaki movies,
right?
Which is like not comics, but obviously he did Nausicaa manga, and which I've read, which is great. But there's something about his movies and his stories that really have inspired a lot of my sort of thought process for approaching stories and comics. So it's kind of weird, like that. Non-actual comics are necessarily my biggest influence at the moment, although there are a lot of great comics out there. I tend to do comics that are more kid friendly, but I love Silver Coin is a great one that I've recently read. I'm a big fan of I Hate Fairyland when that was going, so I get a lot of influences from different places, but for some reason, like Miyazaki over the last like 3 or 4 years has really inspired a lot of my work.
Yeah, very popular, that's for sure. Studio Ghibli, all those works is just amazing.
Well, and interesting enough, like I discovered Miyazaki movies late in life because I kind of had ignored them when I was growing up, and I guess maybe when they were popular at that time, and I just discovered them like almost at the end of my 30s for the first time. So it was kind of like a nice way, I guess, for me to be introduced to these things as a more mature adult, and I could sort of, the way I kind of view the stories and having kids of my own, and the way he like incorporates children and into his stories and things like that, is just really spoke to me. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get talking about your latest book that you have on the go called The Witch of Wickerson. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the story and what inspired you to create it.
Sure. So The Witch of Wickerson is a horror fantasy fairy tale. And I say like horror fantasy, kind of like a grim fairy tale where it's still geared towards kids, but it's got a little bit more of a darker edge to it. Sort of a callback to classic fairy tales, like Hansel and Gretel has like a dark undertone there. So that was sort of the inspiration for the story. And the story is about a witch that's been terrorizing a community of small rodents. And she's this giant pig witch who doesn't see them as living creatures necessarily, more as food, like a food resource. And so it was an interesting thing to play with, that sort of dichotomy of having the community that has children, and there's the whole town, and there's a whole sort of economy and different things going on there, and then you have this like witch who approaches them like she's picking like berries off of a bush. And so it was a fun thing to kind of play with.
Was there any specific type of design you were going after for this particular book?
It was sort of Secret of Nim inspired, because that was really one of my favorite movies as a kid, and still is. So, and having it be like some of the characters are mice, other small rodents. So it sort of inspired that. And just the look, the grittiness. I like kind of gritty animation. So I was trying to kind of capture some of that with my, textures and things like that I used in my color process, to using like an ink brush to do the line art, just so I capture a bit more grittiness.
That leads me to my next question about the tools used to create your art. Now, you just mentioned what you were using for Witch of Wickerson. Do you sort of change it up for each book, or do you stick with a certain type of style as you go through?
I tend to try to pick a style that fits the story. It also gives me an opportunity to sort of challenge myself as an artist if I can kind of pull off a certain look. It all feels like my work, but I notice the subtleties in my approach. I typically will do my lettering and my layouts all digital, even when I'm doing traditional inks, but I don't always traditionally ink my work. The Witch of Wickerson was the first one that I tackled with traditional inks. There's a yearly event called Inktober. I participate that pretty much every year. It's always been something that I just sort of done and participated in. For those unaware, Inktober is sort of like a movement for artists to sort of encourage them to pick up like more traditional tools like ink and like a brush or a pen and nib or whatever, because we're working digital most of the time. Most artists these days, that's how we work day to day. During the month of Inktober, which takes place during October, I had challenged myself last year to create a story where I would do a page a day. That's where the Witch of Wickerson sort of like challenge came. So leading up into that, I was pretty much about 3 weeks out of October when I started to write the initial story. And then when I was writing the initial story, I changed direction. I originally wasn't planning to do an actual like comic style book. It was going to be more of like a single image with some like subtext underneath, like an image for each day. But as I started to write the story, I realized I needed dialogue, and my wife sort of suggested, like, why don't you just make this into a comic? And when she said that, I was like, yes, that's probably what I should do. And so it quickly turned. And so within like a week, I was like rewriting the script, rewriting the story, making it into a comic. And what emerged was the story of Witch of Wickerson. And then I frantically drew, and I lettered and colored a page a day for the month of October. And I got it done, but I barely slept.
That must have been like a 24-hour a day type of effort.
Yeah, well, not quite that much, but it was definitely a lot of hours at the desk. I'd say probably about 12 hours a day, every day.
And that was using traditional method of creating a comic book.
Well, I was doing all the layouts in Clip Studio Paint.
Okay.
So digital layouts, and then I would print it in like a very light blue, so I didn't have to worry about light boxing, and then I could just go straight in with my brush pen over top of that. So I use like a Kiratech Sumi brush pen with carbon black, I believe it's called, ink. So I have like a It's a converter cartridge, and you put it in the pen, and you can use your own inks in it. So
great.
yeah.
Now, I was looking on your site. You also have a free webcomic about the making of The Witch of Wickerson for those who might be looking for behind the scenes. Can you talk a wee bit about what's in that free webcomic?
So Inktober has their own account, and they had asked if they could feature me for one of their months as an artist. And so I thought it'd be fun to sort of like try to illustrate what I went through for Inktober that year. So that's where that little webcomic kind of came about. A funny take on like kind of what I experienced that month.
Will people get some behind the scenes type of advice when they're looking through this?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, a little bit. If anything, just witnessing my struggle, maybe you can learn from some of that. In the back of Witch of Wickerson, I do show a lot of behind the scenes work. It's something I like to do in my books when I can afford the pages to do so. Because as an artist myself, I love behind the scenes sort of tips and tricks and little things that went well, things that went wrong. And so I get into that. I share some of the original story I had and how much it sort of changed over the course of rewriting it into a comic. So I share some of that, some of the early concepts and things like that for the characters.
Great. Now, you and I met up a couple times already in person at the Niagara Falls Comic Con, and then most recently at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. So great opportunities to get out and showcase your work. But I'm wondering, do you have any other plans to promote your books this year? Will be attending any other conventions or festivals?
Yeah, I have one more coming up. I'll be at Fan Expo in Toronto, and that'll be the end of August. And I believe that's the only show I'm going to be doing this year. I kind of kept it light. This is my first year back doing conventions. I just finished doing Forest City Comic Con a few weeks ago, and that was in London, Ontario. So I just sort of had the 4 shows booked for this year. Again, just trying to keep it light, and doing the shows that I'm sort of more familiar with and trying to get out to those. So
how's the response been at these various festivals and conventions for you?
Yeah, it's been pretty good. I went through a big transition in my art career, in terms of pushing more of my own IPs rather than selling fan art. I had transitioned out of that pretty much completely during the pandemic. It's something I've been working towards for a while. And now that I had kind of created a few books of my own and a few IPs, I felt it was kind of time. And the pandemic break was kind of a good time to break away from that stuff when it came to the convention scene. So a lot of people maybe had come to my booth expecting fan art and saw that I was only selling my own wares, my own creator-owned stuff. So, but it went pretty good. Niagara Comic Con is a little more fan art centric, so maybe it's slightly more of a tough sell for original stuff there. But in contrast, like TCAF, the Toronto Comics and Arts Festival, is very much pushes original content and comic books in particular. So did really well at that show. And Forest City went really well with my hometown show there. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how Fan Expo responds to my stuff at this point.
We've talked about The Witch of Wickerson, and with that in mind, I'm wondering, do you have any other up-and-coming projects that you can talk about?
I have one that I cannot talk about yet. It hasn't been announced, but it's something that I've wanted to. It's not my book; it's someone else's that I'll be playing in that sandbox a little bit, and it's a sandbox that I've wanted to play in for a very long time, and I'm excited to do so. They'll have to maybe sign up to my newsletter on my website, and I'll announce it as soon as I can. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't say anything just yet.
Sure, no, we don't want to give anything away. But speaking of websites and people can follow you, where do you recommend people go to find out about your current and your future projects?
So the best way is to go to dereklaufman.com and sign up for my newsletter. And that's typically the best way, just to make sure you get all the up-to-date news and anything that's kind of important. And then from that website, you can follow me on all my social media, various platforms.
Very good. Well, Derek, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Maybe just, keep an eye out for I probably have a couple more projects that I've been kicking around. I have lots of half-baked ideas and I'm trying to kind of get off the ground. So just, follow my newsletter. You can sign up to my Patreon. And, I share kind of some of the behind the scenes stuff directly with patrons there. And yeah, I'm always creating and trying to come up with new stuff. And, I'm just constantly excited. That's the stuff that gets me going, is all the new possibilities out there.
Thanks to Derek for the chat. You can discover more about Derek on Twitter at Laufman, that's Laufman, on Instagram at Derek Laufman, that's DerekLaufman, and online at dereklaufman.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2022.